Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today for a webinar being organized by the Global Institutions Diplomacy and Justice Research Cluster at the Balsillie School. I'm very pleased and somewhat selfishly pleased to be hosting today a friend and colleague, Dr. Daisaku Higashi of Sophia University, who'll be talking to us today on the subject of his latest book, Inclusivity in Mediation and Peacebuilding, United Nations, Neighboring States, and Global Powers. I'll just take a moment to introduce Daisaku, and then I'll hand it straight over to Daisaku to continue. So Dr. Higashi is a professor at Sophia University in Tokyo. Earlier in his career, he worked for NHK, Japanese Public TV, as a program director, and produced numerous TV documentaries, including Rebuilding Iraq, Challenges for the United Nations, a copy of which I have on a shelf somewhere over to one side here. He completed his master's and PhD in political science at the University of British Columbia. So we share that in common, we both know that. And has consulted on Afghan policies with government officials in Japan and the United States. He worked for the government of Japan on its Afghan strategy, announced in November 2009, and then worked for UNAMA, the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, through 2009 to the end of 2010, as a team member working on reconciliation and reintegration when he was stationed in Kabul, and also supporting the Afghan government setting up reconciliation mechanisms such as the High Peace Council, the International Reconciliation Trust Fund, and the Afghan Peace and Reintegration Program. After finishing service with UNAMA, he worked at the University of Tokyo as an associate professor, and at the same time was seconded and served as minister counselor in the permanent mission of Japan to the United Nations from late 2012 to late 2014, where he directed the activities of the Peace Building Commission as part of an exchange program between Tokyo University and the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. After returning to Tokyo, he transferred to where he is now, the Center for Global Education at Sophia University. Talking to Daisaku before this, I do know that he has continued to work very closely in consultation with the Japanese Foreign Minister and the Japanese Foreign Ministry, visiting Iraq, South Sudan, talking to them most recently about how to support the population of Afghanistan since the return of the Taliban. Anyway, I'm very happy to hand this over to you, Daisaku. I will mute myself and put my video onto silent as well, and looking forward to hearing what you have to tell us today. Thanks, Daisaku.
Thank you very much, Aristos, and I really appreciate you and also BSIA, which hosted my talk on my latest book today. So I sincerely appreciate. So let me share my slide with you so that I can make a presentations. So I'm a professor at the Sophia University in Tokyo, and I will skip my self-introduction. But today I would like to present three things. Basically, the argument that I present in my latest book, Inclusivity, Mediation, Peacebuilding, from Edward Elgers, and also case studies like South Sudan, Afghanistan, Syria. And also I want to talk a little bit about the implication of my book on Ukraine conflict, which many people have focused on now. In the last part of my presentations. And as Alistair Edgar kindly introduced myself, I started my career as a program director for NHK and created a lot of documentaries on the international conflict, like a Vietnam War, Middle East peace talk, North Korean nuclear crisis, and also rebuilding Iraq challenge of the United Nations in 2004. But I wanted to be expert on the post-conflict peace building, so I did my master and PhD at the UBC, as he mentioned, and I also worked for team leader for reconciliation and integration in UNAMA until the end of 2010. And then I became associate professor at the University of Tokyo, and I became minister counselor in the Japanese mission to the United Nations and directed the team on the Peacebuilding Commission and the mediations. After I returned to academic, I published my previous book, Challenge of Constructing Legitimacy in Peace Buildings. And then I was invited to the tenure position at the Sophia University in Tokyo and continued to do my research on mediation and the peace buildings. And this is my previous English book, Challenge of Constructing Legitimacy in Peace Building from Routledge. And in this particular book, I argued that there are key 4 factors in creating kind of a legitimate government in the post-conflict state, in which many people have a compliance with rule or institutions in a voluntary mode. This is a kind of definition of the legitimate government. And I argued that first, we need to have like a credible third party, which gives a sense of the impartiality to the process in the post-conflict setting, because there's no trust between among the fighting parties or the party which used to fight before. And the United Nations still has some comparative advantage in terms of giving some sense of the impartialities. I also argue that inclusiveness is very crucial in the post-conflict phases, and also resource distribution, which is how to improve, or resource distribution, which is improving the living condition of the peoples, and also level of the forces like a military and the police. And if you have those 4 key factors, we tend to have a compliance to the result of the election, constitution, the mobilizations, and maybe we will have a legitimate government in the long run after the repeated compliance. But if you have a repeated non-compliance or rejections, maybe government will be eroded. And my book suggests that Iraq and Afghanistan are going to that direction, unfortunately, especially because of political exclusions. And the Timor and the Sierra Leone are going to that direction. And in terms of Afghanistan, it became actually collapsed the last years. But when I published this book, I had a chance to make a lecture in many places, like a City University of New York, Yale University, and also United Nations headquarters. And I got many questions that they understand that the inclusivity is critical in post-conflict peace building. But when local leaders do not embrace it, how United Nations or international community can influence their behaviors? So in order to pursue that question, I applied, and I was lucky to get a grant for scientific research on peace building, political exclusion first, and also the peace building in the political party from 2019 to the present. And I just published this book, Inclusivity, Mediation and Peacebuilding, based on my research on South Sudan, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and Timor-Leste, and it became part of the ACUNS series on UN systems, which Alistair is one of the editors. And in this particular book, I showed my own argument on the issue of the inclusivity and also role of the international actors. In terms of the inclusivity, I basically argue that there's a kind of different natures of the inclusivity in the phase of the mediation during armed conflict and in the phase of the post-conflict peace buildings. So when you are in the phase of the mediation during armed conflict, I mean the people are still fighting virtually, inclusivity actually needs to be flexible in order to reach a peace agreement at first place. But in the phase of the post-conflict peace building, after the fighting was finished, inclusivity or avoiding political exclusion is key to success in terms of consolidating a peace or avoiding relapse of the conflict. So there's a kind of different natures of the inclusivity in the phase of the mediation, during the conflict, in the phase of the post-conflict building. In terms of the international actors, I argue that in terms of mediation during armed conflict, it's a great global powers and neighboring states which have a kind of primary responsibilities. But in terms of the post-conflict peace building, I still believe that the United Nations should play a central role, because if global powers or neighboring power have a decisive role in post-conflict peace building, it could be seen as like a neocolonialisms, and it could have a lot of resistance from the local people. So it's still better for the United Nations to play a central role in the post-conflict peace building. But in the mediation during armed conflict, it's a global powers and neighboring states which should have a, primary responsibilities. And in terms of the inclusivity on the post-conflict peace building, there seems to be like a consensus. In the academic side, for example, Charles Gould published book, Why Peace Fails in 2012, and he argued political exclusion plays a decisive role in most cases of civil war recurrence, according to his kind of statistic analysis. And I also made the same kind of same argument with my case studies, like Afghanistan, Iraq, Sierra Leone, and East Timor. UN Secretary General also published a report on the peace building, and which emphasized there are three key factors. One is inclusivity, second is institutional building, and the mutual accountability. So they emphasize the importance of inclusivity. UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council also adopted the twin resolution in 2016, and they emphasize inclusivity is key to advancing national peace building process. But in terms of the debate or inclusivity in the mediation during armed conflict, I mean, when people are still fighting, there's a lot of controversy. For instance, Cunningham argued it's critical to reduce the number of the veto players in peace negotiation to achieve peace agreement at the first place. But on the other hand, like Weiss, John, and Nilsson argued that the more civil society are involved in negotiation, it's more likely that peace will be sustained. But they also admit that there's a kind of risk that the peace agreements might not be achieved in the first place if there are too many parties. So there's a kind of dilemma of the inclusivity in mediation during the armed conflict. This is my assessment from academic debate. And I think it's reflected in the many UN documents. One of the examples is the UN General Assembly resolution on mediation adopted in 2014, also in 2017. And I actually proposed these sentences to emphasize the importance of the inclusivity in the implementation of the agreed outcome when I was a minister counsel in the Japanese mission to the United Nations. But after I proposed it, EU member state and some another member state wanted to also insert the language to emphasize the importance of the inclusivity in mediation itself. But there's another member state which argued that it might be risky to emphasize the importance of the inclusivity in mediation itself, because sometimes you need to have a flexible approach to make a peace agreement possible. So in the end of the day, we agreed that maybe at least we can have consensus to have this language, inclusive national processes in the implementation of the agreed outcome, which is basically the post-conflict peace building. So in my book, I argue that we need to have kind of flexible approach depending on the different circumstances in terms of the inclusivity in mediation during armed conflict. For instance, the first negotiation will be the one between the two most influential parties, and then they might extend agreement to the larger groups. Or you might have two layers of negotiation, one by core group or one by larger group. So we need to have some flexibility approach in terms of inclusivity in the mediation during the armed conflict. And South Sudan represents that importance, I think. As you know, the South Sudan was become independent in July 2011 after almost 50 years of the fighting against the Sudanese government. But only 2 years after, Riek Machar, Vice President of South Sudan, was fired by President Salva Kiir, and that they started the civil war in the end of 2013. There's a peace agreement between the President Kiir and the former Vice President Riek Machar in August 2015, basically by a lot of pressure by the IGAT, Eastern African Regional Organization, like Kenya, Uganda, Sudan, and Ethiopia. And the Riek Machar returned to Juba, and transitional government was established in April 2016, but only 2 months later, in July 2016, they started military clash again. So there's a big political and military rivalry between the President Kiir, which represent kind of Dinka tribes, and Vice President Machar, which represent like Nuer tribes. So I was not able to enter the South Sudan when I started my research. So I started my research in like Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda by interviewing, for example, like a South Sudan ambassador to the AU Ethiopia, or Peter Adwak, advisor to Riek Machar. And also I interviewed many mediators, including like staff in the IGAT, and also like a UN mediator, including like a Nicholas Haysom, who was a special envoy for South Sudan at that time. I also went to the Uganda to interview the South Sudanese people who are refugees who just escaped from South Sudan to the Uganda. And actually we had almost 220 million international refugees coming from South Sudan, and also 200 million internal displaced people. So South Sudan became one of the most catastrophic failed state in the time of 2018. But in March 2019, I was assigned by the Japanese foreign minister to go to South Sudan to make some contribution to peace building. So I was able to interview like a first Taban Dengai, first president of South Sudan, or minister in cabinet affairs, minister of higher education, the person who steers national dialogue, head of the UN mission in South Sudan, and also Ismail Ace, IGAT special envoy for South Sudan, which steers some kind of peace negotiation in the South Sudan. I also made a lecture at the Juba University and had a lot of conversation with a student who used to be like refugees before when there's a big conflict. I also see some construction site by JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency, like a bridge in the Nile rivers, and also the water system for Juba. And according to those research, I found that there's a kind of revitalized peace process for South Sudan, which was started in December 2017. And that this process had a faction of President Kiir and Vice President Machar, but also like 20 political groups coming from South Sudan. But unfortunately, there was no sight in having any peace agreement by a series of negotiations by those 20 groups, because every group represents their voice, but there's no momentum to make any peace agreement. So in the end of the day, IGAT, Eastern Regional African Bloc, decided that it's necessary to have some agreement between President Kiir and Machar at first. So Mr. Abiy, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, invited both Kiir and Machar to the bilateral meeting, but they could not reach to any agreement in June 2018. So Abiy gave up, and he requested Mr. Bashir, the president of Sudan at that time, to make some kind of mediations. And the president of Sudan at that time accepted that request because he had a leverage for the Vice President Riek Machar, because he supported Machar's faction for many, many years. But he did not have any leverage against, President Kiir. So he requested Museveni, president of Uganda, to take President Kiir to the capital of Sudan, Khartoum, because it was Uganda which supported President Kiir for many, many years. So in the end of the day, Museveni agreed, and he took the President Kiir to the Khartoum, and there's a very intensive discussion or negotiation by those four persons. And it created kind of basic agreement between the President Kiir and Machar first, and then it got outreach to other 20 political groups, which was originally in this process. And most of them agreed on the new peace agreement. So, and that was one of the reasons why I was able to go to the South Sudan in February 2019. And the 2 years the implementation is slow, but still in February 2020, the revitalized transitional government national unity was established with return of the Mr. Marshall to Juba's first vice president. And this agreement is really power sharing agreement. So the 20 cabinet was appointed by Mr. Kier, 9 by Marshall, and 6 by other groups. And surprisingly, this 2018 peace agreement has still been maintained even while there are many fragilities. So I think a case of South Sudan represents some kind of importance of the flexible approach on the mediations during the conflict. Case of Afghanistan might be more critical or controversial. As you know, there was a start of making a nation building process in 2002 after United States attacked the Taliban regime in the end of 2001. But there's no effort to include the Taliban into the nation building process until 2009. So it was quite exclusive nation buildings. In 2010, there's a mechanism to international community and the Afghan government decided to create a mechanism to start negotiation with the Taliban. And actually, I worked for the UNAMA as a team leader for reconciliation. So I supported the Afghan government to establish the key mechanisms. But unfortunately, there is no sustainable peace talk among the Afghan government, the United States on the one hand, and the Taliban, and also like Pakistan, which supported the Taliban. So in the end of the day, Taliban decided or started requesting the United States to have some kind of bilateral negotiation. United States refused it first, but President Trump, President Trump decided to accept that request from the Taliban because he said, oh, if the Taliban want to talk with us, we should talk. And it's surprising the United States, the Taliban had a very sustainable series of the bilateral talk in Doha, facilitated by the Qatar from October 2018 and February 2020. And there's a deal between the United States and Taliban signed in February 2020. And the United States decided to withdraw all the forces by 14 months. And the Taliban promised that it will do their best not to allow the international terrorist group like Al-Qaeda or ISIS to station in Afghanistan. That was a deal between the United States and the Taliban. And then in September 2020, the Afghan government and the Taliban finally started the peace negotiation. So I argue that this process still might be necessary to start some kind of a political talk. And there was a negotiation between the Afghan government and Taliban in Doha in September 2020 like this. So I thought that it's very important last year. So I decided to start a series of the online seminar on Afghan peace process. Together with Nadia Naim, who was a former vice chair of High Peace Councils, and also director of Peter Dew, director at the UN headquarters in charge of Afghanistan, and also director in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan in January 2021. And we got about 300 audience or participants. So we decided to have a second seminar together with Habiba Sarabi, a female member in Afghan government negotiation team which had a negotiation with the Taliban, as well as the UNAMA directors, Japanese Director General, and also Dr. Alistair Edwards. And because we had to support kind of Afghan peace process. And I and Nadia Naim decided to negotiate Abdullah, number 2 in the Afghan government at that time, to have the third seminar, and he kind of accepted the offer. But in the process of arranging the date and time, the Afghan government was actually collapsed on August 2021, as you know. So yes, the peace process was failed. I need to admit. Some people still argue that the dialogue between the Abdal and the Taliban in Doha had some role in avoiding all-out war in Kabul, when the United States withdrew its forces. As you know, in the final 2 weeks in August, from the August 1st to August 15, there was almost no fighting. Afghan government army decided to surrender to the Taliban almost voluntarily or without any significant fighting with the Taliban when they know that the United States will withdraw all the forces by the end of August. So, but this coordination between or continuous talk between the Afghan government and Taliban in Doha had some role in coordinating a kind of avoiding the all-out war, especially in Kabul. And I'm very worried about humanitarian catastrophe in Afghanistan after the Taliban took over. I might not have enough time to speak about that in this first presentation, but I'm very happy to have some discussion with you in the Q&A sessions. In chapter 5, chapter 6 represent the case of the Syria and the Yemen, in which show when global power and neighboring states are divided on how to end the civil war, it's extremely difficult for envoys to achieve peace agreement. For example, in the Syria, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Turkey, and the United States EU supported opposition in Syria. On the other hand, Iran and Russia have been supporting the Assad regime very adamantly. And actually, Russia started military intervention in September 2015 in Syria. So at that time, when the Russians started military intervention, only 1/3 of the territory, which is this red one, was controlled by the Assad regime. The opposition, which is the green one, controlled about 1/3 of the territory, and the ISIS, this black one, controlled almost 1/3 of the territory. But only 1.5 years later, Assad regime, which was supported by Russian and also Iranian military, restored almost 70% of the territory in the Syria, and the opposition was confined to the only 4 places. So when I conducted my research in September 2017 and 2018, I interviewed most of the representatives of those countries in Geneva, as well as Stefan de Mistura, who was a very special envoy for Syria. He said, I'm not naive to tell that there is no possibility of military end, but if there is no political solution, chronic insurgency would be continued. That was his logic, which tried to persuade Mr. Assad to make some political concessions and to make peace agreement. But Mr. Assad did not listen to that kind of logic. And he continued a military operation together with Russia, and he now controls most of the parts of the Syria. So I think this development might have some impact on calculus or calculation of Mr. Putin, president of the Russia, on the issue of Ukraine. In chapter 7, I examined the case of Iraq and the East Timor, and those cases really show that how inclusive political process or avoiding political exclusion are so crucial in post-conflict peace-building phases and in consolidating a peace. I had a chance to go to Iraq, but because Foreign Minister of Japan, requested, assigned me to go to Iraq to make some peace-building contributions. So I interviewed Mr. Maliki, or 3 vice presidents of Iraq, including Mr. Maliki, which represent the Shia faction, Mr. Najafi, which represent Sunni factions. Maliki used to be the prime minister, as you know. Mr. Rawi, which represent the secular factions, and also Talabani, who was the head of the Kurdish political parties. I also had a lot of discussion with the expert on these issues. There was an election in May 2018, and I returned to Iraq in February 2019, and I interviewed a former Prime Minister Abadi and also again 3 vice presidents. I also had a chance to talk with many professors and experts in Baghdad universities. And those interviews really showed how those interviews actually indicate that most of them agree that political exclusions especially against Sunni faction, had a decisive role in having this conflict in Iraq after 2003 when the United States attacked Saddam Hussein regime. So there's a one big civil war around 2006, and then United States or US forces decided to include a Sunni insurgency or insurgent group into the nation building process by making a lot of Iraqi Awakening Council all over the country. So violence was reduced once until the 2011, and the United States forces withdraw. But unfortunately, after that, Shia-led government started kind of political exclusion against Sunni political faction again. And the ISIS was expanded. So they needed to have a fight against ISIS. In the end of the ISIS was shrinked, almost abolished, but there's a huge sacrifice. So it shows how it's difficult. So I think those kind of historical experience has some implication about what will happen on Ukraine conflict. It's so difficult even for global powers to establish new government by having military interventions. And I think a 20 years history of like case of the Iraq and Afghanistan really show that fact. And especially when Ukrainian people seems to be very unified or united in opposing the Russian invasions, I think the creation of the new pro-Russian government is certainly to be impossible. We are not quite sure what is the real purpose of the Mr. Putin, but if he wants to create some pro-Russian government in Ukraine, I think it's very, very, very difficult or almost impossible, to be honest. I also wrote in chapter 8, conclusion chapter of the book, that the biggest challenge for the UN peace operation in the future might be whether or not the United States and the West, like a democratic state, and China and Russia, like a non-democratic state or also autocratic state, can maintain some level of the cooperation on UN peacekeeping operation and the peace building, even when, like President Biden defined that there's a global competition between the democracy and the autocratic state. And I think that this Ukraine conflict, I'm afraid that the Ukraine conflict will really make it more difficult for UN Security Council to maintain some level of the cooperation on managing the military conflict. So this could be huge challenge, and I don't have an answer yet, but I hope that Japan, like a middle power, like Canada and Japan, can play some role on this particular issue. So I want to hear your opinion as well. So thank you very much, and let me finish here.
Yeah, thanks very much. I know Eric has joined us and he'll be looking at the Q&A, but perhaps I can hand it to Tim to lead off on questions for you, Daisaku.
Thanks, Alistair, and thank you, Professor Higashi. I very much appreciated your comments. Very much look forward to reading your book. I've been tasked with posing the first one or two questions because I've been working on similar issues around both peace building and inclusivity for a number of years, and I'm also was interested to hear your comments on the Ukraine context as well, and the larger Security Council issue with regard to managing peace operations in the future. We had a roundtable a couple of weeks ago where which was really about whether the Security Council was broken, which seems even more relevant today, a week after Russia's invasion. So I'm going to steer clear of that. I suspect there are others who might pick up on that, but I'm particularly interested in coming back to this basic idea of inclusivity in the context of both mediation and peace building processes. And I wanted to start with, I guess, the fundamental question of inclusivity of whom. As you know, probably better than I mean, these are, whether we're talking about Afghanistan or Syria or South Sudan, these are very complex, multifaceted, multi-ethnic countries. And one of the challenges of inclusivity is really around trying to figure out who actually deserves a seat at the table. Certainly, I heard loud and clear from your presentation this question of prioritizing flexibility, and I would agree with you that there's really no other option. It's difficult to impose a formula for inclusivity. But I guess my question more specifically is really around the choice between the inclusivity of armed actors, right? Those who could potentially emerge as spoilers if they're excluded from the peace process. This is, if I understand correctly, I mean, this is Charles Call's argument in the book that you mentioned in the context of your presentation. So that's one set of actors to be included. The other set of actors that one often hears about is the marginalized, right? Those who have typically been excluded from politics more generally. So women as kind of first and foremost among them, the youth, disabled people, vulnerable minorities, as kind of a whole other category of those with a claim to have a seat at the table in peace process. So I'm wondering if you could just reflect a little bit on those two poles, if you will, in terms of how one might prioritize between those two. Again, if one needs to be flexible and selective. Right? How do you, I mean, assuming one can actually make these determinations, right? How do you prioritize, if that's the right word?
Thank you very much. So we have two, it might be good for us to have some distinction between the mediation during the armed conflict and the phase of the post-conflict peace buildings. And in terms of mediation during the armed conflict, when the people are still fighting, yes, sometimes we might need to focus on the negotiation between the armed group at first place. There might be some political realities. But for example, in the case of South Sudan, there's a negotiation between only the President Kiir and Mr. Machar until 2015 August. And it was collapsed very quickly. So that's one of the reasons why IGAD decided to have like a broader participations of the revitalized peace process, inviting like a 20 political group in addition to President Kiir Machar faction and the President Machar factions. And I don't think it was vain. I don't think it was a waste of the time to have that broader participation, and it was good if they can make agreement by having those larger groups, including like women's groups, civil society group, and youth groups. But in the case of South Sudan, they were not able to create any peace agreement. So in the end of the day, they returned to the bilateral negotiation between the President Kiir and the Machar. And after they had agreement, they extended to those 20 political groups. But at least in the first 6 months, those 20 groups actually had the opportunity to make a voice. And I don't think it was a waste of the time. But if there's a political reality that they cannot make agreement in the larger groups, they might need to have another flexible approach. And if this flexible approach can create some political agreement first, we might not be able to reject it only because it was not, it did not have all actors in the first basic agreement. Because when I did the research, there's a lot of critique about this peace process, revitalized peace process, by saying that it was not inclusive. But we cannot be so dogmatic in terms of the phases of the making the peace agreement. But it's also true that in the evolving phases, we might need to have more and more representations. So when I interviewed Nicholas Hayson, who was a special envoy for South Sudan and Sudan, he committed a lot to peace building, like South Africa, Afghanistan, and he suggested, of course, there's no unified principle, but it might be true that until we have a ceasefire agreement, we might need to have, basically we need to have the presentation, or negotiation by the armed group. But once they have a ceasefire agreement, it's necessary to expand the scope of the representations so that we can get more and more voice to make a more comprehensive agreement. So I think that could be one of the things to think about. In terms of the post-conflict peace building, after the peace agreement is signed, it's very important not to have political exclusion. This is my argument. Because in principle, if you try to make some kind of democratic state after having a peace agreement, you need to have a right of participations to political process in definition if they try to make a democratic state. But for example, Taliban in Afghanistan or many Sunni groups like a deep Ba'ath Party in the Iraq and the Iraq National Army in the Iraq did not have right to participate in the political phases or political process, even though they try to make some kind of democratic state. So there's a kind of fundamental contradiction, and it creates a lot of spoilers. So in terms of the phase of the post-conflict peace building, my argument is that it's very necessary to have not to have political exclusions. And it's very difficult to define what is inclusivity, but my sense is that it's an opposite concept of the political exclusions. So it's very important to avoid the political exclusion in the post-conflict peace building. And I think Charles Gould's basic argument is that when you have a political exclusion, they tend to have a relapse of the conflict. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Alistair, I'm going to throw it back to you. I'm conscious that we don't have tons of time left. So, and I know there's some Q&A. I have other questions I could ask, but I'll maybe wait to see if there's any time at the end. So I'll pass it back to you. Thank you, Dr. Higashi. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks, Tim. Eric, I see you're up. Do you want to handle the Q&A and pass those messages along to Daisaku?
Yes, for sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Higashi. That was a very interesting presentation. We have a couple questions in the Q&A right now, and I also have a few questions for you if we have time. The first is from Dr. Andrew Thompson, and he asks, did you come across any cases in which a UN special envoy has been able to broker some kind of peace agreement? And if not, does that say something about the special envoy mechanism?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question, but I think, for example, in the 1990, in like El Salvador or Nicaragua, the UN Special Envoy made a very important role in making a kind of peace agreement. But after 2000 or 21st centuries, we don't have so much record of the success by UN Special Envoy in terms of making peace agreement during the armed conflict. And there's a kind of structural reason. I mean, when United Nations started big peace building operation in Cambodia, peace agreement itself was signed by 4 key factions on Cambodia, but which was mediated by like Thailand, China, Japan, and also those states. But after they have, 4 factions in Cambodia had a peace agreement, they requested UN Security Council to dispatch UN peacekeepers, and the UN, peacekeeping missions have had a very important role in conducting election and consolidating the peace. So in the structures, I think it's the same for the Sierra Leone. When they had a Lomé agreement in 1999, it was basically pressure, navigated to pressure by the neighboring state, also like the United States and those powers. But after they got the Lomé agreement, they requested UN Security Council to dispatch UN peacekeeping operations, and the UN peacekeeping operation played a major role in consolidating peace in the Sierra Leone. So I I think it might be a little bit naive to think that only UN Special Envoy can make a peace when they are still fighting. So that's something that I wanted to emphasize in this book, that we need to have like a major power, or global powers, and also neighboring state, which really need to make a big commitment to make a peace, because they have a stake, or they have a leverage for the conflicting parties. So I'm a little bit afraid that there's a tendency that global powers and neighboring states sometimes use UN Special Envoy as an excuse that they are supporting a peace, but actually they are supporting military factions militarily on the grounds. So in this case, UN could be abused by those states. So we need to, I think it's important to have some kind of recognition that we have that kind of risk of using or abusing United Nations mediation efforts. So it's really important for us to recognize that it's a global powers and neighboring state which need to be united to make an end of the armed conflict. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much. We have a really excellent question here from Shaza Ahmed, and it actually intersects quite a bit with the question I wanted to ask, so I might rephrase it a little bit. But essentially, what do you do? There's been a lot of talk, obviously, in the peace building literature about hybrid security governance, and particularly in Afghanistan and sub-Saharan Africa. And what do you do with quote unquote unsavory actors that you had to include in the security structure during the conflict, but during the peace process? I'm thinking most relevantly right now of things like the Azov battalion in Ukraine. If it threatens the legitimacy of the new peaceful regime, what should you do with those actors?
I mean, like a former insurgency or yeah. I think it's important for us to recognize that historical records show that when you include the former enemy, it's much easier to make a peace. For example, in the Sierra Leone, there's as you know, Revolution United Front, which was very notorious about attacking the very civilian institutions and also the government. But after they had when the RUF and the government of the Sierra Leone had a peace agreement allows RUF to participate in the national election as a RUFP political parties. And they got only 1.7% of the vote in 2002 elections. So politically it was become minor, but still they had a right to participate in the political or national nation building process. And many Sierra Leone told me that it was one of the reasons why they did not go back to the conflict again, because at least they had an opportunity to participate. It's interesting that in around 2002, the Taliban also had agreement. I mean, Taliban escaped to the Pakistan side after United States attacked the Taliban regime in 2001. But there's a Quetta Shura meeting. I mean, the most important decision-making body of the Taliban at that time, and they agreed, or they made a decision that they want to start talking with the Karzai government in 2002 to participate in the nation building process. So they sent a letter. So they made a decision that as long as they can get some kind of security assurance, they want to start talking with the President Karzai about how they can be involved in the nation building. So they sent a letter, but Afghan government, also United States, actually ignore it. It's also true that Mr. Mutawakil, the former foreign minister of Taliban, suggested or offer or even suggested or proposed to the CIA officer in 2002 that if they are allowed to make a political party of the Taliban, he's very certain, or he's very confident he can bring many Taliban high-rank officials to this Taliban political party. But so CIA officer sent a letter to the, or a cable to the Vice President Cheney, but Cheney responded according to the book by journalist. He said that no, you cannot, you should not have talk with the Taliban, but you should destroy it. So this is something that I introduced in my book. But yeah, there are many academic and also journalistic research or investigation that the Taliban was quite eager to have a talk or participation in the time of 2002, but it was refused. So they actually decided to have all-out military insurgency against the government around in like 2004, 2005. So, and then 15 years later, we got these consequences. So I think it's relatively, it's not so easy because now we have a lot of argument about accountability of some war crime, but I think we should have some priority on what is the most important thing in the each phases. And if the local people want to have a peace, it might be necessary to have that kind of inclusions. Yeah.
That's really fascinating. Thank you very much. We have an anonymous attendee with quite a good question here as well. In a number of your examples, regional dynamics and contestations have a small influence on the scale and scope of the conflict at hand. On the whole, do regional powers tend to act as spoilers or facilitators of mediation processes in your experience?
Is it a question by?
It's actually an anonymous attendee who asked the question. Yeah, but it's a good one.
And
so essentially, what role is there, if any, for regional powers to play in inclusive peace-building processes?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question correctly, but if he or she is asking about role of the regional power in the post-conflict peace buildings, it's very decisive. And in terms of the mediations during armed conflict, the case of the Syria might be quite a clear example, because when the opposition, or there was a big peaceful demonstration started in 2011, it was very peaceful, but the Assad regime started making a lot of military operations against those demonstrations. So, of course, it was a responsibility of Mr. Assad. But after that, many GCC countries, Gulf Council corporations, state like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, and also Turkey, decided to make a huge military and budgetary support to oppositions in the Syria. And one of the reasons is that those GCC countries had a perception that they lost Iraq after United States invaded the Saddam Hussein regime in 2003, because it used to be one of the GCC countries, right? That Iraq used to be one of the GCC countries which the Sunni had the dominant power, but it changed to the Shia-led government or regime, which had a huge, or which became very close to the Iran. So Saudi Arabia, UAE, and those countries really had a perception they lost Iraq. So when the opposition started in the Syria, they had ambitions to change the Syria regime from the something which was very close to Iran to the something which became very Sunni-led state. So that's one of the reasons why those countries really made a big military or budgetary support to the oppositions. And of course, Iran reacted that they wanted to keep Assad regime as a regime which is very close to Iran. So it became kind of a proxy war of the regional power, like Iran and which reflect the rivalry between the Saudi Arabia and Iran. So I think expansion of the conflict in Syria really represents some kind of a risk of huge rivalry among the regional powers. And as long as they do not have some kind of compromise, it's very difficult to make a peace agreement in the Syria. And it's exactly the same in the case of the Yemen. As you know, the Houthi got the capital of the Yemen in 2015, and the Saudi thought that they need to react to make a military intervention to the Yemen to preserve the kind of a regime which is close to the GCC country, because they thought that if Yemen also becomes the side of the Iran, it could be very fatal for the Saudi and the GCC country. So I always argue that in the end of the day, we need to have some kind of facilitation of the talk between the Iran League and also like a Saudi Arabia League to think about how they can at least coexist in that region. It might be not so easy to make a real reconciliation, but at least it might be better for both countries to have some kind of coexistence. And I'm hoping that Japan can play some role to make that kind of facilitation of the talk, because we had a good relationship with both Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but also the Iranian regimes. It's very sad to see this kind of a conflict in the Ukraine, but those kind of crash or shock hopefully can induce some of the momentum for those regional power like Saudi and Iran to have some kind of a compromise and the dialogue. And they actually started in the last 2 years by the mediation like Iraq, which is interesting. But so, yeah, I think that the regional power had a huge leverage and influence on expansion of the conflict, but also the containing and the making some peace on the region. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much. I'm conscious of time, so I think I'll throw it back to Tim for final question or final word. Or Alistair.
How about we throw it to Alistair? I think we're at 12:59, so probably not enough time to squeeze in another question.
Fair enough. Back to you, Alistair.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. And I think the last discussion also addressed a question from Ali earlier about regional powers that might have different interests. And the example he gave there was Pakistan's interests in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So Daisaku, thank you very much. If people aren't doing their time zone calculations, it's now 3 a.m. for Daisaku in Tokyo, which gives you an idea of how dedicated he is to these kinds of issues as well. I'm not sure if I would be on a call at 3 a.m. It would be a struggle for me to keep my eyes open. So I definitely appreciate it, Daisaku. And with my series editor hat on, I also appreciate your contribution to the book series. This is the fourth in the series, what was the ACUNS, but the ACUNS series on the United Nations with Edward Elgar. And I'm although I've seen obviously several iterations of the manuscript as it's gone through, I'm looking forward to also getting a copy of it, which I can start scribbling into as well. I very much appreciate the people who've asked questions and everybody else in the audience. Thank you for joining us. Thanks to Joanne as well for setting up all the technical stuff, and Tim and Eric as well for posing questions and managing them. And if people have other questions that they want to direct towards Daisaku, perhaps they can feel free to email them to me, or I can give people Daisaku's email address and they can contact you directly as well. So thanks very much, everybody. It's certainly been a pleasure to do this today. I'm not sure if it's a distraction from events in Ukraine, because we did mention Ukraine, but it's nice to talk about something else once in a while as well.
Thank you very
Daisaku,
much.
thank you very much, and get some rest over there.